Hey everybody, welcome to episode 38 of the AskDAP show where we answer your Volkswagen Audi questions. On this episode, we talk about parts to replace during a suspension install, Mark 7 downpipe install causing a thunking noise, and what to replace to prolong the life of your tuned engine.
Carlos Ortiz via email says, I have a 2014 VW CC R-Line. I want to lower the car about an inch. I've decided to go with KW V2 coilovers. It's an install that I will perform later this year. What are some other parts that I should be looking into that should be upgraded? Also, what are some hidden costs when it comes to upgrading the suspension? Thank you, Carlos.
Okay, so Carlos, in regards to things you would need to install whenever you're doing that type of suspension install, I want to start with one quick note about the system you chose. Coilovers may not be the best choice for you if you're only looking to lower it an inch, unless you're going to be doing some sort of track stuff or you're really looking to get the handling that you would get from a really quality coilover. The other alternative would be maybe go with springs. They would be significantly less expensive. You wouldn't get the same ride height adjustability, but if you're only looking to lower the car about an inch, going to coilovers may not be the best choice, or you might want to go with a cup kit or something like that. Bilsteins would be a good choice, as well as KW or H&R or any of those are going to be solid choices for coilovers if that's the route you decide to go. In regards to parts you would need, the biggest thing I would say, for me, I always recommend to anybody over probably 10,000 miles to look at doing strut bushings and bearings every time you do a suspension install. And here's why. Some people say that's probably overkill, but especially if you're paying somebody to do the job, it's very expensive in labor to pay somebody to do a suspension install like that. So to not replace all that stuff, to then turn around and have a knocking noise come from the suspension, which by the way is super common on a lot of cars. If you install suspensions, it's very common for people to come back after a very short time and have a knocking noise, which generally comes from the strut bushings. So strut bushings and bearings would be the number one, and then all the associated hardware that's recommended by VW. A lot of people, obviously some people do suspension installs without replacing the hardware. Some people do. As per VW, most suspension bolts are intended to be one-time use. So I'll put a link here to all the hardware and stuff we have available for that car, and you can look at kind of what you want to replace for your personal preference.
Cam Mark 6 via VW Vortex says, so just now I was parking outside and there was a thud sound coming from the gear shifter when I put it in park. I could also feel the thud below the shifter while putting it in P. This has never happened before. I have a 16 GTI with 5,000 miles. Any idea what it could be?
Okay, so this question was actually asked on Vortex and I grabbed it, and this was actually, it doesn't say that in the question, but it was actually after a downpipe install. So I can be pretty sure that this is very likely to be one thing where the downpipe installs and actually has rubber bushings and meets where the subframe is. It actually basically holds it to the subframe itself. There's two nubs that kind of stick through bushings and then bolt to the subframe itself. What's likely happening is the engine is flexing, and because of how close they are to the subframe, they're actually hitting the subframe. That's what I suspect it to be. It's possible that's not what it is, but I would definitely go back and check your work, check that specifically, maybe have somebody load the engine up to see if you can get it to move or rock the engine and see how close those little rubber, those nubs are through that rubber to touching the subframe. Because if they're close enough under pretty decent load, they can get in and kind of touch that. That there is an adjustment bracket when doing a downpipe install, which if you adjusted it out further, it would remove the downpipe further depending on how much adjustment this specific downpipe, I don't know what downpipe you have, but that downpipe would have the ability to move away possibly, and that should hopefully solve your problem.
This issue normally happens more during traffic jam. The car shuts off when it comes to a stop and sometimes erratic idling before it happens, but the car starts right after. Sometimes I can smell petrol, no error code, and tried everything at the dealer. PCV valve changed, N85 valve changed.
So issues like this on FSI, this is super hard. The fact that there's no fault, there's a lot more diagnostic that would go into actually tracking down a problem like this. But just at first glance, when I see this issue, it feels like a fuel issue to me. So I would look at fuel related things. I would start with, since it's an FSI, always 100% of the time on FSIs, always start with the cam follower, the fuel pump, and the camshaft to see where they're at. I'll put a link to, we have an article that specifically discusses all the stuff around that camshaft and high pressure fuel pump. We also have a DIY showing you how to remove and install the fuel pump, which is in that as well. So you can, I'll put a link to that here, and you can check all that info out. If that checks out okay and your cam follower is fine, the high pressure fuel pump's fine, the camshaft isn't worn, I would probably go with possible electric fuel pump issues, which is either related to the fuel pump in the tank, which would be under the rear seat, or it's going to be related to the fuel pump module. But it seems like it's probably more electrical fuel pump in the tank or the high pressure fuel pump. The fuel pump modules generally overheat and then take some time to get back to where they allow the car to run again from my experience. So I would say definitely go down the road of checking those fuel systems, and then hopefully that'll solve your problem.
Chris via email says, been doing a lot of research on the forums and watching your videos. One question I did have, and possibly others, when getting an ECU flash or tune beyond stock powers that the engine was designed for, what measures / upgrades can we do to make sure that the longevity of the engine isn't affected?
Okay, Chris, so things you can do to prolong the life of your engine on a tuned car. There's not really much you're gonna be able to do. Maintain the car properly, take care of it, and don't beat the hell out of it. Probably would be another great way to not completely destroy the car. But outside of that, there's really not a lot you're going to be able to do to prolong the life of it. It's not like, oh, here's this thing you can do that's going to make the engine last a lot longer. I wouldn't even say spark plugs or an intake or a downpipe are going to necessarily prolong the life of it. They're really more for optimal performance of the engine. So the only thing I would say you're going to do to maybe prolong the life of anything on the car would be the clutch, is to upgrade that to ensure that the clutch doesn't blow. But that's more so that you don't end up with a clutch that's blown and stuck on the side of the road. Aside from that, I mean, upgrading the turbo if you wanted to make sure the turbo wasn't going to blow, but I don't know if that's a practical choice for most people to make, to upgrade the turbo just in case. I had a question about that before and I recommended against it. And maybe for some people that is the best choice is, oh, I have the old revision turbo, I want to make sure I don't get stranded. Upgrade to the IS38, which we'll link to here. That could be an option for you, but it's not a necessity by any means, because your turbo is either going to blow or it isn't. And everybody has to decide whether they're willing to take that risk for that issue. But I suspect that most of the cars that have had turbo issues are going to already have had them. Again, I've said this multiple times, our car is stage 2, and while I don't drive it hard, we haven't had any turbo issues. So to say that all the old revision turbos would just blow like crazy, that's not the case. It seems like maybe there was some sort of weird QC issue that caused some of them to blow prematurely. So I would say, unfortunately, there's nothing I can tell you. I would love to tell you, hey, buy this from us. Here's something that'll prolong your engine life, but I just don't think that's accurate. The one thing you might want to consider would be a catch can, just because it does prevent more contaminants from coming back in the engine, but I'm not sure that's going to actually prolong the life of it. Again, that's one of those things that for performance sake, prevent carbon buildup and prevent contaminants from coming back in the engine, which keeps for a clean burn during the engine. But I don't think that's going to necessarily prolong the life of anything if it were to have an issue.
Don via email says, I truly enjoy your YouTube channel. This is not really a parts question. However, you seem to know your stuff. So are there any known issues with the first gen TSI engines that have come in the 2012 GLIs? Very interested in strengthening any weaknesses she may have.
Okay, Don, so the number one thing, I guess you may not have seen, we have an article that I wrote a while back about common problems on TSI engines. I would check that out. We'll link it up here. The one thing I would say for certain, 100%, and I've covered this to death, but I really want to make sure we touch on this for people, is check your timing chain tensioner. The earlier revision timing chain tensioners, if they had an issue, would pop, causing the timing chain to jump and allow the valves to contact the piston, bending the valve. So that would be a pretty significant damage. You're looking at probably $4,000 or $5,000 repair bill to fix that, probably best case scenario. So for sure you should check that. Now 2012 was a split year as far as all the research we've done for the updated tensioner. So some of the 2012s got the new tensioner, some of them did not. There is a video that we have a link to in our common problems article, which Charles, our buddy, the humble mechanic, he did a video showing where the inspection plug is and how to check it. And that would be the best thing to do. Check that, make sure that's up to date. If it isn't, try to get that done as soon as you can to prevent yourself from having any headaches. Outside of that, I would say not really much else that you should necessarily see as a weakness other than maybe the diverter valve. And that's in that article as well. We'll link to, there's a Pierberg diverter valve that we offer. That's a pretty common one because they went from a diaphragm style diverter valve to a piston style. I'm not sure what year exactly that happened, so 2012 may or may not have it. We have in that article we have a link to shows you how to remove and install it, so you can check to see if you have a diaphragm style or not. We also have a video explaining more detail about that. Other than those things, the PCV valve would be something you want to look at because a blown PCV valve could cause a rear main seal leak. Outside of that, I would say you're pretty solid once you go through those few things. You know, there are a few little things here and there other than that, but those are the things you probably want to look at before you start modding the car, before you start spending money. Spend the money to make sure that you're not going to put yourself in a really bad spot with that timing chain tensioner thing. And then with the diverter valve, that would also help ensure that you're going to make sure that if you tune the car, you're not losing all the boost once that diaphragm blows out and then you're just leaking all the boost off that you originally are working so hard to get in the first place. Thank you for watching episode 38 of the AskDAP show, where we answer your Volkswagen Audi questions. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.